Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I'm Roy Kessel, your host, and this week we're very excited to have with us Bethany Henderson. Bethany, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're excited to have you with us today. We know you do a lot of great work with DC Scores and America Scores, but before we go into your work with those organizations, why don't you give us a little bit of a background on yourself and how you got into this space?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by training and a social entrepreneur by trade. My career has really crisscrossed the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And almost 6 years ago now, I joined the Scores family at DC Scores, really looking for an organization that was doing incredibly meaningful work on the local level, helping to level the playing field for all kids.
Well, I know that you guys have done a great work in expanding across the country. It looks like from your background, obviously, you've been involved in a lot of different types of areas. Tell us a little bit more about the type of legal work you did and then what prompted you to make the transition out of law into this type of work.
Sure. So I actually began my career working for the city of New York on this brand new thing called the internet way back in the day, and how city governments could use internet technology to make government work better for people. After going to law school, I ended up doing litigation, business litigation for a big firm, a lot of it related to intellectual property. So You Stole My Idea, my TV show, my movie script kind of thing, both in New York and Los Angeles. But I'd had an idea from my experience in New York City to start an organization to get more young people involved in local governments, get folks coming out of college, going home and working for their communities. So I left the law in 2007 to found an organization called City Hall Fellows, social enterprise. I ran that for a number of years in different cities around the country, really a local government service corps. So think of like a Teach for America for city governments. So I did that for a while, learned how to build nonprofits and scale them, and then had a great opportunity to join the Obama administration. So I worked inside the Obama administration on domestic policy issues, really focusing, one of the main things I focused on was My Brother's Keeper, and learned a lot during that time about the disparities in outcomes, the disparity in opportunity for children of color growing up in poverty in this country versus white children or suburban children growing up in different economic circumstances. And so coming out of the administration, I knew I'd wanted to go back into direct impact work, much like I'd done with City Hall Fellows. I loved working at the local level, and joining the Scores family really married a lot of my passions: team sports, working with low-income kids, level that playing field, creating opportunities for kids to get involved in their community, because service learning and civic engagement is a huge element of our programming here at Scores.
Well, you covered a lot of ground there. I think it's amazing when you talk about the challenges of building a nonprofit and scaling that. That's one of the areas that we see frequently with the members of our network and the challenges that they face in taking a good idea, having some good work in the community, and then trying to make sure that they can grow that organization, understand how to get all of the pieces in place in terms of the funding, the participants, everything that you need. As you know from what you're doing now, there's a lot of moving parts to running an organization. So as you did that work in the nonprofit space, you talked about City Hall Fellows. How did you start in that space? Because that's a lot to undertake. Most people aren't able to execute that from the outset.
It's a lot to undertake, and for me, it was a lot of learning as I went, trial by fire, trying to, I called it beg, borrow, and steal my way into any possible training program I could, and with support of lots of other people who knew a lot more than me. There's a concept in the social enterprise space called being a resource magnet that was either coined or amplified by a woman named Cheryl Dorsey, who runs Echoing Green, which is an organization that invests in early stage social enterprises, nonprofit and for-profit. And the concept of being a resource magnet means that you are a person or an organization that pulls resources into you, right? That you are able to do more than you should with the resources you have, because you're constantly bringing in new resources, whether that be time, expertise, dollars, volunteers, et cetera. And to really scale an organization in the social sector, being a resource magnet is a really important characteristic for an individual leader, for an organization. And I think for me, I was lucky. Something I'm knew how to do, or I figured out I knew how to do pretty quickly, was get other people involved and engaged, and pulling those folks and those resources along was what really helped me scale City Hall Fellows at the time. What's been really invaluable here at America Scores and DC Scores, it's not about me, but it's about how can I get a whole bunch of folks working together in support of our common mission.
Well, I think that the challenge of being a resource magnet that you identified is that's a skill set that somebody has, because it's very difficult to teach that. When you look around at the organizations that have launched successfully, that have really been, I'll call it personal projects that somebody's taken under their wing, it's really driven by those individuals that have that type of personality, the ability to go and reach out and bring those resources to the table. So as you were starting that first nonprofit and using all of your talents to get that off the ground, what did you find to be the most difficult area for you? Each entrepreneur, each business owner, right? Every executive director or founder of a nonprofit, everybody finds different challenges as they go along the way. They've got a great skill set that allows them to get it off the ground, but they each find areas that are challenging.
So that's a great question. I'll first say to your comment about resource magnet being a skill set, I'd say yes, and. Anybody can learn how to be a resource magnet. It's really a mindset more than a skill set. Anybody can learn the skill set. It's putting yourself in the mindset of, I need to draw resources to the bigger cause, as opposed to centering it on, you yourself, or your way of doing things. So I'll just put that out there, because a lot of people think they can't do that. And I say, no, you can, but you have to have that mindset and be open to that. For me, the biggest challenge, and I think this is true for many folks who start organizations, is you don't start an organization because you're really excited about figuring out insurance policies and HR and making sure you're in legal compliance and accounting and grant management on the back end. But that is most of what you spend your time doing, right? Most people who start an organization or found an organization do it for the cause, because they're really passionate about the issue. They're really passionate about their solution. And as a founder, you spend a lot more time on the administrative stuff, especially if you're scaling, than you do working directly on the cause. And so figuring out how to balance that, how to not lose your connection to the cause, and how to really understand why all the accounting and legal stuff is super important to you being able to be successful, I think is a huge challenge for anyone. It was certainly a huge challenge for me, and I had to learn, as I said, a lot of it on the fly. I knew the legal stuff. I'm a lawyer, but I didn't know the accounting. I dropped out of accounting in law school. I hated it. Well, now I know a lot more about accounting and nonprofit accounting to boot, because I've had to learn. And so being open to constantly learning those types of things, I think, is extremely important. The other side of it is fundraising. Some people are natural fundraisers and they love fundraising, going out and asking people for money, but that is not my passion. It is not what I enjoy doing. And yet it is absolutely critical and essential to scaling a nonprofit, especially, right? A for-profit, you have a little bit different mechanism for revenue generation. And getting comfortable with that act of asking people for money, of fundraising, is really, really important.
I think you raised some great points there, because you talked about the insurance, the HR, the accounting, compliance, grant management, all kinds of things that go into it. And it reminds me of when I was representing a lot of entrepreneurs and startup businesses. People would come to me and they would tell me they wanted to start a new business to do whatever it was. Let's call it graphic design. They got tired of putting up with the BS at their former employer, and they felt that they needed to have a more, quote unquote, pure experience of just doing the graphic design and not having to deal with the corporate side of things. And I would try and tell them, I said, look, right now you're probably dealing with 80% graphic design and 20% administrative burden and other types of things that the organization is putting on you. I said, as soon as you start your own business, that's going to flip. You're going to be spending 80% of your time, or at least what you used to think of as your work week, right? You're going to be working a lot more hours, because you've got to figure all of these things out. And if you want to run your own business, you're going to have to be at the outset the one that handles these things. And many of the want-to-be entrepreneurs don't have a legal training, a legal background, which I think is a skill set that allows you to really figure these things out. You talked about a lot of areas, and even with the legal background, the things you're talking about aren't the types of legal work you were doing at a big law firm in New York City. So while you had the skill set to learn how to figure it out, right, you still actually had to sit down and do that. And uh, I always find it interesting when organizations look and say, well, we can just bring somebody else in to handle that and bring somebody else in to handle the next thing. And right, pretty soon before they've even started their organization, they've got a staff of 10 or 15 people to handle everything that they don't want to do. And then they start realizing that what they're doing is really their core function is only sort of 10% of what needs to happen in that type of organization. And it's interesting that you raised the fundraising element, because that's always the number one component that people come to us and talk about how to do fundraising, what's the best way to approach it, who should approach it. And the challenge is that every nonprofit is looking for more money. There's virtually no nonprofit that'll sit there and go, yeah, no, we're good. We don't need anything more. That's the lifeblood of the organization. And as with most executive directors, and that's what they spend a huge percentage of their time in that space. How do you conquer that with, because it's not only you, it's your entire staff and your organization, and then really every chapter of your organization that has to do fundraising. So how do you handle that as you bring people into the organization? Is that something where you're looking primarily for people who've got that experience, or are you training people as they come up through the organization?
So that's a great question. So here at America Scores, we're actually what I call a grassroots by the network for the network model. We're not a top-down umbrella. So each of our affiliates, DC Scores, where I sit, but Bay Area Scores, Boston Scores, Milwaukee Scores, are all independent 501c3s. And it's intentional because so much of the funding for what we do is at the local level. What that means is that every affiliate needs a fundraiser in its organization. But in the nonprofit world, fundraising is not just, if it's done effectively, it's not just done by the executive director. If you're big enough at operation, you can have a fundraising staff. And here in DC, I've got several people whose primary job is fundraising. In that case, I absolutely look for people who have experience in that, as well as the mindset. Because the mindset of an effective fundraiser is not, hey, I'm doing something good, give me money, and you should like what I do. It's, I am doing something important, we are doing something important, you care about what we are doing, and therefore I'm asking you to invest in our shared interest. And it's about making that investment. And so having people who have experience with that, knowing how to make that ask, how to tee it up, is important when you're scaling to a big size. On a more micro level, in our organization, everybody's a fundraiser. So everybody has the opportunity and the responsibility to be a brand ambassador in the community, every staff member. And we want every staff member out there sharing and talking about what we do. And every time they wear our brand out in the community, they are representing us in some form or fashion. So we do crowdfunding days like a lot of organizations do, and everybody gets, friends and family. That's the most micro level. But on the more macro level, I can introduce you to any staff member at any time, and they'll be happy to share a Scores story with you. They'll share with you their experience, why it matters to them, and be able to talk to you about what your experience is. And that's been a very intentional and deliberate process on our part to get everybody comfortable with telling their stories and their experiences, to have alumni get comfortable telling their stories and their experiences in a way that's safe and authentic and real, and shares what it's really been like for them and why Scores matters to them. Because at every opportunity, we have to be communicating. It's not just limited to the people who do fundraising. Our entire communication side as well is really important. What are the stories we are telling? How are we getting beyond the one-on-one? And that's just the staff side. The other side of fundraising in the nonprofit world is the board side. It's a huge role and responsibility of the nonprofit board to generate a significant portion of the revenue for the organization, and also to open the doors to people that go above and beyond the staff's network, right? Otherwise you don't grow, you get stuck in your echo chamber, your ecosystem. And so at each of our affiliate levels across the America Scores network, as well as at our national level, we have boards of directors who are actively working with the executive directors, local executive directors, to fundraise, to generate dollars and to bring in new prospects. And the last thing I'll say on this is, people think about fundraising, they think about, hey, Roy, you like what I do? Can you give me $10,000? Right? That one-on-one direct ask. Or they think about grant writing. There is a process. I'm going to check the boxes. I'm going to fill it out. I'm going to send it in, and hopefully someone's going to get it back to me, give me money. The reality is, If you are submitting grants cold, meaning you don't have a pre-existing relationship with the organization or with the program officer at the organization, your odds of getting that grant, and this is a foundation grant, government's often lower, your odds of getting that grant is maybe 1 in 10, right? The returns aren't great if you're just spending a lot of time on that. And so an effective organization that's able to be financially sustainable has a diverse funding. It has some funding from individuals. It has funding from foundations. It has funding from government grants or contracts. It has funding from corporate partnerships. It has funding from events. And it spreads that out. Generating money like that takes a long time and a lot of effort because a lot of it is relationships at every level, whether it's a strategic corporate partnership relationship, an individual donor, or the act of writing and reporting on a grant. And so being really intentional about from my organization and what we do in the market and how our solution works, what our best opportunities to raise money today are and where we need to get to 10 years from now in terms of diversity of funding to be sustainable requires a fair amount of time and effort. And so a lot of my time, I'd say more of my time is spent in the strategy of that than in the, hey, Roy, can you give me $10,000 today aspect.
Yeah, and you've covered a lot of ground there. I think you raised some excellent points. And one of the first questions I always get about fundraising, as people look at it, very few people are comfortable up front going and asking for money. It's sort of an acquired taste. It's a process of doing it, realizing that if you're approaching the process correctly, that the people you're reaching out to, as you said, share your passion, share your vision, right? I think your quote was, we're doing something. The mindset is, I'm asking you to invest in our shared interest. And I think that the challenge is when you go through the first step, a lot of people look to, aside from the staff, obviously, is the board. And one of the first questions is, how big should the board be? So you've got boards in a number of cities around the country. Do you have a defined size that you use for all of your chapters, or is that something you allow them to dictate on a city by city basis?
Each of our affiliates sets the size of its own board. There's lots of board resources out there, and Board Source is one of them. And, you can go find the quote unquote best, most theoretical reality, or what your best practice theoretically should be. But I would say it evolves over time. And so at different stages of the organization, you need different types of board members, and you may need different sizes of boards to accomplish what you want to accomplish. It also depends what your board is doing. So if your board is a group of very heavy hitter fundraisers, and that's what they do, and they all give 50 to 100 grand a year, you may not need as big a board if you're a smaller organization than if you're a larger organization and need more of those people. Or if you have a board of 12 people who do a lot of work but don't contribute a lot of money or bring in a lot of money. And so for me, the size of the board and the role of the board evolves over the lifespan of the organization. It's different at different stages. It should be different at different stages.
Yeah, there's so many elements to the fundraising, and I like the point you raised about the grants, just soliciting grants cold without any conversation with the program officers or the organization to understand what that group is looking for and what types of programs they're going to fund. It's almost like submitting a resume without knowing what the job description is. And you see so many people just thinking that grant writing is a cut and paste process that, okay, we've prepared our grant, now we're just going to send the same stack of information to all kinds of places that may be interested in funding us. Obviously, that that's not the case. And so take us through how you approach the grant making, not the grant making process, but the grant application process, because you've seen it so many times and you've got a pretty good sense of what strategies are going to work.
So I love that analogy about the resume. I've never heard it. I think that's a perfect way to describe it. Grant writing is sales and marketing. It is a marketing function. It is not a, hey, here's what we do and hopefully you'll like it. It is about figuring out what the funder is interested in, why they care, what their angle into what you do is, and where what you do aligns with them. So the big risk in submitting grants is twofold. One, you just submit your stock stuff. It doesn't speak to what they care about and you don't get the funding. Two, you write to just they want and it causes mission creep because you're not staying true to what you want. So what we really try to do is thread the needle. So we look at every funder, every organization we might submit a grant to. We say, okay, what do they care about? What are they actually willing to fund? And how does this align, or does it align with what we are doing? Because at Scores feel very strongly about our core programming, that it works, that we know our model works. We don't want to do 14 other things. We want to do what we do well. And so we want funding that's going to support that, not funding that's going to take us away from that mission. So once we determine whether there is alignment, we say, okay, where is the alignment? Because it is almost never absolute alignment. I think I've had one funder in the almost 6 years I've been here, that said, yes, we want to fund poetry and service and soccer because that directly aligns with what we do. Typically, we'll have a funder who cares about anti-obesity, right? They want to bring down obesity rates among inner city children, or funder who cares about Latino children specifically because that is that funder's particular interest, or academic attainment, or physical fitness, or mental health resilience, or trauma-informed approaches to coaching, or making sure that every child is kitted out properly, or someone that cares only about soccer balls. And the job of the executive director of the senior team is to figure out, right, how do you knit all of that funding together to support our core program? And so we look at the alignment, and then we say, okay, how can we communicate to this funder what they actually care about from our programming? And so I call it a multifaceted prism. So we are at the core one thing. We do one thing, we do it well, we know what we do, it's worked for 25 years. But the angle of the prism that I might refract to you as a sports interested funder is going to be very different than the angle of the prism that I'm going to refract to the person who really only cares about poetry, or the organization that really cares about academic attainment. Same organization, same program, I'm showing it to you from a different lens. And that's where the marketing really comes in, is thinking about, am I communicating, and this is true whether it's a grant writer, an individual donor, a corporate partner, whatever, am I communicating to the donor the aspects of what I do that they are going to care about? Because that's going to hook them in. And then I can show them the breadth of everything that's underneath it and how it all connects and why. But if I don't hook them in with what they care about, I've lost them from the beginning. And that's, I think, a really important thing when you're talking to a program officer at a foundation or a government agency, saying, I really want to understand what you guys care about. Do you care about mentoring? Do you care about health? How does it touch what I do? And I can then reflect back in their language.
I think that's fantastic, because I love the line that you used about making sure that it's a marketing function, because you really are, you're reaching out and you're trying to, you've got to position yourself as a better investment for that grant maker than any other competing organization that's applying for that same grant. And that's a function of looking at what you've accomplished, and as you said, reflecting that prism so that they're seeing the areas that are important to them, right? Your core work isn't changing. You're not going into your programs and saying, well, this group's funding it this way, so now we have to stop the poetry or stop the soccer or whatever the case may be. You've got great programs, and I had the opportunity to go to your poetry slam in Chicago, and it was a fantastic environment. You could just see the energy and the passion that the kids have had. I had the chance to visit with Jeff out in LA and looked at the work that they're doing and the results that they're getting there through your curriculum. It's incredible looking at the numbers and the success that you've had. And I think you've got so much amazing data that is substantive, because one of the challenges that many organizations have, especially when they start out, is how do we quantify and justify the work that we're doing? So as you said, SCORE's been doing this for 25 years now. So when you came in, it had an established base. It had a lot of things there. What are the challenges that you see still ahead in terms of that measurement and that impact to continue to be able to raise that bar and expand the offerings?
And that's a great question. Two things. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now is that there is no consensus on best practices or best guidelines in the field yet for measuring social emotional competencies in learning. So that's a big jargon word, social emotional competencies, but what it really focuses on are kids more resilient? Are they more confident? Are they more engaged in school? Are they essentially not mentally ill, but are they mentally healthy, right? Kind of those basic, some people call them soft skills, some people call them life skills, some people call them character skills, but it's, do they have that mental resilience, fortitude, strength, network connections, and engagement that will help buffer them against challenges in life. And for us, because we work with kids who experience a lot of trauma, who grow up in poverty, who experience a lot of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs is the technical term, this is a really important thing. This is a really important thing that we do here at SCORES with the teams that we build. Yes, our kids get more physically fit. Yes, they do better in school. But at the end of the day, we believe the most lasting impact we have on them is that mental health evolution. All right. There's no consensus in the field about how to measure that. So we measure it. We follow the best practices that exist. We're involved in a lot of the organizations, the conferences that talk about this, but there's no gold-plated standard. If I tell you, my kids are 3 times more likely to pass the ELA, English language scores, especially second language learners, as their peers, that you can picture that in your head, right? Everybody knows what that means. You see a test score and it goes up, but that means something. There's not an equivalent on the social emotional learning side. So that's a big challenge for the sector. That's not just a challenge for us, but in terms of communicating to people who aren't as familiar with the academic evolution of social emotional learning and what that means, that's a challenge for us because it's such a core to what we do. Another challenge is that someone said this to me recently, I thought it was brilliant, that the plural of anecdote is not data and vice versa. But you need both. And so where the right balance is between telling the stories of brilliant young people who have overcome incredible life adversity and are now at Princeton and Georgetown and playing soccer professionally and working as a fashion designer and whatever it is that they're doing, where they have really gotten off of the preschool to prison pipeline that many of them are, it's too easy for them to fall into by virtue of circumstance and really on that cradle to career trajectory. Those successes are amazing. And yet quantifying that is also really, really hard. And quantifying that over 25 years is harder than it seems like it should be because, even as early as recently as 5 to 10 years ago, we weren't tracking everything digitally because that's not the way our schools worked and our families worked. And so one of the big projects we have going on right now is figuring out how do we look longitudinally over that time frame and say, okay, I can tell you, I know within a year the impact that SCORES has on a kid. But what about the typical impact over 20 years or 15 years or 10 years? How do we track those kids in a way that's effective and gives us real useful information that goes beyond the one-off anecdotes? Because we know anecdotally our kids are doing better than their peers, but how do we actually prove that out? And then the third challenge with the data and measurement and eval side is that a lot of funders want it and few funders pay for it to be done effectively and properly. And so how do you do it fairly and accurately and authentically and intentionally when you don't have funding to dedicate to a person to actually do that? Because doing it right's time consuming.
And I think we should go through all of these because as you look at those challenges, as you said, those are not specific to DC scores or America scores. So those are the same challenges that almost every organization in our network is dealing with as we talk to them. And the guidelines on the best practices for the social emotional learning and those things are very hard to measure because there's so many factors that go into that in terms of family, in terms of school, in terms of everything else that child is exposed to. One of the challenges is always separating out what is the cause and effect and how much of that impact, right? Even if there is improvement for kids that have come through your program, right? You can show a control group of kids that are at the same school and you can compare graduation rates and everything else. And that's probably a reasonable way to measure it for what's going on right now. But now when the kids are done with your program and you're talking about the longitudinal studies, how do you compare that over 10 years? Because you no longer have control. They're no longer, in a sense, subject to your ongoing input and guidance in the same way that they were when you're in school. And I think that's a great issue that you raise there. The funders, fortunately, it looks like some of them are starting to realize how important it is. It's like we tell you we need data, but we've got to give you money to go and get the data so that we can really evaluate what you're doing. And The other part I liked when you talked about the anecdotes and the data, it's I remember when I was working as an NFL agent, and you would look at players and you would talk to scouts, and they would talk about wanting game film, not highlight tapes, because their typical mantra was, even my grandmother can look good on a highlight tape, right? So you need to have the hard data, right? You need the numbers from the NFL Combine or a pro day workout, but I need the game film because that tells the whole story, not just the highlights. Now, obviously, unfortunately, not everybody has the patience to watch that game film.
Right.
You talked about fundraising. You're going to donors. You're going out on social media. You need to have that storytelling. In today's world, people have about 14 seconds, if you're lucky, that they're going to give you, right? Very frequently, it's flipping through the phone. It's about 3 seconds that you're going to get for them to have it go past the screen, and they're going to be interested, and maybe they'll watch a short video clip or something. But unless you're at a fundraising dinner, it's pretty hard to get somebody's attention for them to sit down and watch even a 10 or 15-minute video, much less more details. And so how do you run that balance in terms of telling those stories to different audiences? Because you really have, in the type of organization that you're dealing with, right, you've got the participants in the program that have to have one story. You've got your staff is a different story. Your donors is a different story. Your board is another story. The community, and then all of your affiliated nonprofits around the country, right, in as part of your network, they really are buying into this whole program that Scores has together. And I think it's interesting how you bridge all of those different communications.
So that's a great question. And it's a challenge, and it takes time. And if we're telling everybody different stories, then we're running into a big problem. Because at the core, it all needs to be the same core, right? So as I think about it, what we really think about doing is making sure that we are sharing with each audience what matters most to them, what's most salient to them. So for our kids and our families, we want to make sure we're sharing pictures of all the game days, and that we're putting up their videos on YouTube of their poetry slam, so the families can see it even if they can't be there in person. I don't make different videos for the donors. I just then pick and choose among that to curate the next. I don't do it, my team does it, right? But we curate among that for the next audience. So we create a huge body of content, which sounds daunting, but it's really not. I mean, it started out, we've gotten more sophisticated over the years, but it really started out with a staff member with an iPhone sitting there and recording the activities, right? Staff member, when they go out to fields, taking photos, and we have media waivers and image releases built into all of our paperwork that the parents sign off on from the beginning, so we don't have to get it onesie twosie. But it really started out with us doing that super organically. And as we've gotten more sophisticated, we've had volunteers who now come out and do it, who are actually professional photographers and videographers. We have a videographer on staff. We've actually made a documentary this year called Soccer in the City that really tells the story of the history of soccer in America's inner cities and why organizations like America Scores play an important role both in growing that sport and in building the connections among and within kids growing up in those communities. And so while we're a through line in that, it's not about us, but it's storytelling. But that's a super sophisticated version. You don't need to do that to start. You just need to be thoughtful about, what am I capturing? Once I have this body of content, which parts of it am I showing to which people? And what framing am I putting around it to show to which people what stories? So again, for the Poetry Funder, I'll show them the Poetry Slam YouTube videos because that's what they're going to care about. And the Soccer Funder may not care about that at all. They really want to see the pictures of all these kids on soccer teams, right? And playing soccer. So it's just about being thoughtful and taking it step by step, not trying to do it all at once.
There's no question you can't do it all at once. As you said, this has been built over 25 years. And so it certainly evolved. If you went back and could do the figurative drone flyover for year one and really watch what was going on, it wouldn't look anything like what you're doing now. There's certainly a lot of challenges to get something off the ground. And and I give you guys immense credit for what you've been able to accomplish and continue to accomplish. I think that what you've shared has been fantastic for all of the people to learn from, because I think one of the areas that is often very difficult for new organizations is getting comfortable asking questions of other people who've been through that battle before, and reaching out and finding resources of somebody who understands what those challenges are for a new organization. Maybe a little bit more, somebody that's just starting would be one group, someone that's been doing it for 3 to 5 years and really trying to take it on, and then the groups that have been around and been successful for 10 years. You talk to them, and every single person I speak to will tell me, like, just like in any other business, right? They're not happy with where things are. We know we can get better. We know that we can handle this element better. We know that we can improve that. And I think you've identified those things. So I appreciate all of that input. And as you look ahead now for the next few years, what do you see on the horizon in terms of what your biggest goals are in the next 3 years?
So for America Scores, we are really focused on growth. We know our program works. We know it has lasting impact on the kids in the communities. How do we bring it to more kids, and how do we do that in a sustainable way? And by sustainable, I mean, we don't show up somewhere and go, we're here, and then a year later go, sorry, psych, money went away, we're not here anymore. Because one of the worst things that can happen for the kids that we work with is for more organizations and people, no matter how well-meaning, to show up and then disappear, because that happens a lot. So for us, being a consistent part of the community, whatever community we work in, is core to our culture, core to our impact, and core to our identity. And so how do you scale that way is a hard thing, right? Because we want to make sure that we're able to be there, you're in and you're out, with whatever additional funding that takes. So that's something we're looking at both at the affiliate level at each individual community, and at the macro level, adding more sites, more affiliates across the country. How do we do that? Now, the other thing for us, and this isn't so much sort of a forward-looking goal as a constant effort on our part, is culture of the organization, culture of the program. Because what we do, working with people, we don't work on people, we don't work by people, we don't work near people, right? We work with people, and we work to support communities from within. And doing that requires a lot of intentionality, a lot of humility, a lot of listening, right? A lot more listening than doing, and making sure that every new team member who joins our organization understands that culture and why it's important and why it's a kid-first experience, from the curriculum to the environment we create in that team. That they understand why when I walk down the street wearing a shirt that has the DC Scores or America Scores logo, strangers will holler at me, go, oh my God, DC Scores! I was at DC Scores in whatever school, whatever year. Because they feel so connected to that culture and that community. We take that really seriously. We take that responsibility really seriously to those kids and the families. And so maintaining that culture as you scale, like I said, requires you to be very intentional and very thoughtful. And that is constantly on our minds.
I think that's always a big challenge for every type of organization, right? Entrepreneurs start a business, and then all the culture is here, right? It's me, I'm starting the business. That's great. Now I hire Bethany. Okay, I can probably relay that pretty effectively to you one-on-one. And the next layer. But as you start getting into double digits or triple digits or beyond, it's really hard to get that culture communicated. And it's really interesting to see initiatives that are going on in that regard. So Bethany, I want to thank you for coming on with us today. I think you gave people a lot of great insight into what you've been working on and how you've been doing everything. And congratulations on everything that you've accomplished.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been great talking to you.
This is Roy Kessel signing off for the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. We hope you'll join us next week. Thank you.